In the rural Missouri winter of 1974, 3 children were discovered standing in the snow outside a farmhouse. They were barefoot and silent, their eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When the sheriff asked about their parents, the oldest child, a 9-year-old girl, pointed toward the barn. A dirt floor, dug up and refilled, was found inside. Beneath it, something had been feeding for a very long time. The Branson family had lived on that land for 4 generations. By the time the authorities arrived, only the children remained. What occurred on that farm didn't begin in 1974. It had been happening long before anyone thought to look. And what they discovered beneath the barn was merely the beginning of a truth that certain people in that county still refuse to speak aloud. Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. 11 miles outside a town called Harrow's Bend, population 342, sat the Branson farm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and no one asked questions they didn't want answered. The family had been there since 1891, when Silas Branson claimed the land and built the farmhouse with his own hands. 4 generations later, it was still standing. The barn was, too. That barn was older than the house. Some say Silas didn't build it. Some say it was already there when he arrived, and that's the very reason he chose that plot of land. By 1974, the family consisted of Marcus Branson, his wife Lorraine, and their 3 children, Annette, Thomas, and little Claire. Marcus worked the land. Lorraine homeschooled the children. They kept to themselves, which wasn't unusual for farming families in that part of Missouri. But there were rumors. There had always been rumors. People in Harrow's Bend didn't talk about the Bransons much, but when they did, it was in low voices at the back of the general store or after a few drinks at the roadhouse. They would mention the smell that drifted from the property on certain nights. They would talk about how the children never seemed to play, never seemed to laugh, and they would bring up the animals. Dogs that wandered onto Branson land didn't come back. Livestock from neighboring farms would disappear, and Marcus would always offer the same explanation: coyotes, maybe a mountain lion. But the wounds on the animals they did find didn't match any predator anyone recognized. On January 14, 1974, a postal worker named Dutch Emery drove out to the Branson farm to deliver a certified letter. When he arrived, he found the 3 children standing in the front yard in the snow. The temperature was 11 degrees that morning. The children wore no coats, no shoes. Dutch said later that Annette, the oldest, looked at him as if she were trying to remember what words were. He asked where her parents were. She pointed toward the barn. Dutch went to the door of the farmhouse first. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was cold and silent. The kitchen table was set for 5, but no one had eaten. The beds upstairs were made. Everything looked normal, except for the smell. It came from the cellar. Dutch didn't go down there. He went to the barn instead. The barn door was open. Stepping inside, Dutch Emery immediately felt the temperature drop even further than the winter air outside. He called out for Marcus Branson. No answer. The barn was mostly empty. A few bales of rotting hay, some rusted tools hanging on the wall, and in the center of the floor, a section of dirt that looked freshly disturbed. The earth there was darker than the rest, almost black, and it had been packed down recently. Dutch knew what a grave looked like. He'd served in Korea. He'd seen enough dirt covering enough things to recognize the signs. He didn't touch it. He went back to his truck and radioed the sheriff's office. Sheriff Raymond Talbot arrived within the hour along with 2 deputies. They brought the children inside the farmhouse first, wrapped them in blankets, and tried to get them to talk. Annette would only repeat the same thing: they're downstairs. Thomas, age 7, hadn't spoken at all. Little Claire, just 4 years old, sat in a kitchen chair and hummed a tune no one recognized. It didn't sound like a children's song. It sounded older than that. The sheriff left 1 deputy with the children and took the other to the barn. They dug up the floor. 3 feet down, they found the first body. It was Marcus Branson. He'd been dead for approximately 4 days, but it wasn't the cold or the passage of time that had done the most damage. Something had been feeding on him. The coroner would later describe bite marks inconsistent with any known animal in the region. The teeth patterns were wrong, too many of them, too uniform, and they went deep down to the bone in some places, as if whatever did this had been trying to get inside him rather than simply consume flesh. 2 feet deeper, they found Lorraine Branson. She'd been dead longer, perhaps a week. The same feeding pattern, the same inexplicable wounds. But there was something else. Her hands were bent backward at the wrists, broken deliberately, and her mouth had been forced open so wide her jaw had dislocated. The sheriff asked the coroner if this could have happened post-mortem. The coroner said, no. Someone had done this to her while she was still alive. And then they'd buried her in the barn and let something else finish the job. But that wasn't the worst part. Beneath Lorraine, they found older remains, much older. A skeleton that had been there for years, maybe decades. And beneath that one, another. And another. By the time they stopped digging, they'd uncovered 6 bodies in total. The 2 most recent were Marcus and Lorraine. The 4 beneath them had been there so long that identification was nearly impossible. The sheriff sealed the barn. He called the state police. And then he did something that people in Harrow's Bend still talk about. He went back inside the farmhouse and asked Annette Branson a question that no 9-year-old should ever have to answer. He asked her if she knew what was buried under the barn. She looked at him with those empty eyes and said yes. She said her grandfather had told her. She said it had always been there. She said it was hungry. The state police arrived the next morning with a forensic team and 2 psychologists specializing in child trauma. They wanted to interview the children separately to get clear statements about what had happened. But the moment they tried to separate Annette, Thomas, and Claire, all 3 began to scream, not crying, not panic, but screaming in a way that made the deputy step back. It was synchronized, as if they were all responding to the same invisible signal. The psychologists decided to keep them together. They brought in a child advocate and a stenographer. What those children said over the next 6 hours was never officially released to the public, but pieces of it leaked over the years. Fragments that people in law enforcement whispered about. Details that made their way into private letters and sealed reports that were never meant to be opened. Annette told them that her father had been feeding something beneath the barn for as long as she could remember. She said it had been his job, passed down from his father and his father before him. She said the family had an agreement, a covenant she called it, though no 9-year-old should know that word. The thing beneath the barn kept the land fertile. It kept the crops growing even in drought years. It kept the family safe from sickness and misfortune. But it needed to be fed. At first, it was animals, livestock, pets, things no one would miss. But over time, it wanted more. It wanted something closer to human, and eventually it wanted human. Thomas didn't speak during the interview, but he drew pictures. The psychologists gave him paper and crayons, thinking it might help him process the trauma. What he drew made 2 of them leave the room. He drew the barn. He drew figures standing around a hole in the floor, and he drew something coming up out of that hole. It didn't look like any animal. It didn't look like a person either. It looked like something that had learned to mimic the shape of a person but hadn't quite gotten it right. Too many joints, too many angles. The psychologists kept the drawings. They were entered into evidence and then quietly removed from the case file 3 months later. No one explained why. Claire was the youngest, and they didn't expect much from her, but she was the one who said the thing that made everyone in that room go silent. She said her mother had tried to stop it. She said Lorraine Branson had told Marcus that it was evil, that they needed to leave, that they needed to burn the barn and salt the earth and never come back. Marcus had refused. He said the family had made a promise. He said if they broke it, the thing beneath the barn wouldn't just take them. It would take everyone in Harrow's Bend. It would spread. And then Claire said something that the stenographer wrote down word for word. She said, "Mama tried to kill it. She went down there with a knife, but you can't kill something that was never born." The forensic team finished their excavation of the barn on January 20, 1974. In addition to the 6 bodies they'd already found, they discovered something else beneath the deepest remains. There was a hand-dug shaft. It went down another 12 feet into bedrock. At the bottom, they found a chamber. It was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, and the walls had been carved with symbols no one could identify. Not Native American, not European, nothing that matched any known language or religious iconography. The chamber was empty, but the walls were wet. Not with water, with something thicker, something that smelled like copper and rot, and something else underneath that no one could name. One of the forensic investigators took a sample. The lab results came back inconclusive. The substance contained organic compounds, but they didn't match any known biological material. It was as if it was organic, but not from anything that had ever lived in a way science could recognize. The state police tried to trace the origins of the older bodies found beneath the barn. Dental records didn't exist for most people in rural Missouri before the 1950s, and 3 of the skeletons were older than that, but they did manage to identify one of them. His name was Samuel Corrigan. He'd been reported missing in 1947. He was a drifter, a veteran who'd been passing through Harrow's Bend looking for work. The last person to see him alive was Marcus Branson's father, Ezra, who'd hired him to help repair a fence line. Samuel Corrigan was never seen again. Ezra Branson told the sheriff back then that Samuel had finished the job, collected his pay, and moved on. No one questioned it. Drifters came and went. But now, 27 years later, they knew where Samuel Corrigan had ended up. Ezra Branson had died in 1968. The death certificate said heart attack. But people who'd known him said he'd been acting strange in the months before he died. He'd stopped going to church. He'd stopped talking to his neighbors. And he'd started spending hours in the barn alone in the middle of the night. His wife, Margaret, had died 2 years before him under circumstances that were never fully explained. She'd fallen down the cellar stairs and broken her neck. Marcus had been the one to find her. He was 16 years old at the time. After Margaret died, it was just Ezra and Marcus on the farm. And then 6 years later, Ezra was dead, too. And Marcus inherited everything. The land, the house, the barn, and whatever was underneath it. The investigators tried to go further back. They wanted to know if Silas Branson, the man who founded the farm in 1891, had known about the thing beneath the barn. They combed through county records, old newspapers, church registries. What they found was strange. Silas Branson appeared in the census records starting in 1891, but there was no record of where he'd come from. No birth certificate, no immigration papers, no family history. He simply appeared in Harrow's Bend with enough money to buy the land and build a house. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, no one seemed to know anything about Silas Branson before he arrived, and the land he'd purchased had a history of its own. Before Silas bought it, the property had belonged to a man named Josiah Carner. Josiah had built the barn in 1873, and he'd lived there alone for 11 years. In 1884, Josiah walked into the center of Harrow's Bend in the middle of the day, stood in front of the church, and slit his own throat. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say a word. Witnesses said he'd looked relieved. After Josiah's death, the property sat abandoned for 7 years. No one wanted it. People said the land was cursed. They said Josiah had done something out there, something that had poisoned the ground. But in 1891, Silas Branson bought it anyway. And he didn't just buy it. He moved into the barn first, before the house was even built. He lived in that barn for 3 months alone. And when he finally emerged to start building the farmhouse, people said he looked different, thinner, paler, but his eyes were bright, hungry. The investigators brought all of this to the district attorney. They laid out the evidence, the bodies, the chamber, the history of the land. They recommended that the property be seized, the barn demolished, and the entire area excavated by a team of archaeologists and forensic experts. The district attorney listened and then he closed the file. He said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges against anyone still living. Marcus and Lorraine Branson were dead. Ezra Branson was dead. Silas Branson had been dead for decades. The children were victims, not suspects. And as for the thing beneath the barn, the thing the children had described, the thing that had left those wounds on the bodies, there was no legal framework for prosecuting something that might not even exist. The case was classified as a double homicide-suicide. Marcus Branson had killed his wife, then himself. The older bodies were declared cold cases, likely transients who died of exposure or misadventure and been buried on the property by persons unknown. The chamber beneath the barn was noted as a historical curiosity, possibly related to early settler activity or indigenous practices, though no anthropologist could verify that claim. The barn was condemned, the house was condemned, and the property was left to sit. The Branson children were placed into foster care. Annette, Thomas, and Claire were kept together at first, per the recommendation of the psychologists who'd interviewed them. They were placed with a family in Springfield, Missouri, about 90 miles from Harrow's Bend. The foster parents were good people, experienced. They'd taken in troubled children before, but within 2 weeks, they called social services and asked for the children to be removed. They wouldn't give specific reasons at first. They just said it wasn't working out. But when pressed, the foster mother admitted something that went into a sealed report. She said the children didn't sleep. She said they would stand at the window of their shared bedroom every night, all 3 of them, staring out toward the west, toward Harrow's Bend. And she said that on the 13th night, she'd woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning and found all 3 children standing at the foot of her bed. They weren't doing anything, just standing there watching. When she screamed, they didn't react. They just turned and walked back to their room in perfect silence. The children were moved to separate foster homes. After that, the psychologists thought maybe the trauma was reinforcing itself, that being together was preventing them from healing. Annette was placed with a family in Kansas City. Thomas went to a home in Jefferson City. Claire, being the youngest, was placed with a couple in Columbia who specialized in early childhood trauma. For 6 months, things seemed to improve. The children were going to school. They were eating. They were starting to talk more. Though they never talked about the farm, never mentioned the barn, never spoke their parents' names, the psychologists called it progress. But then on the night of July 19, 1974, all 3 children disappeared. Annette vanished from her bedroom on the 2nd floor of her foster home. The window was locked from the inside. The door was closed. Her foster parents checked on her at 10 o'clock that night, and she was asleep. At 6 o'clock the next morning, she was gone. Thomas disappeared from a group home where he'd been moved after his foster placement didn't work out. The night supervisor did a bed check at midnight. Thomas was there. At 2 o'clock in the morning, his bed was empty. The doors were locked. The windows were barred. No one saw him leave. Claire was taken from her bedroom while her foster parents slept 15 feet away. They heard nothing. When they woke up and found her gone, they called the police immediately. The search began within the hour. 3 days later, a hunter found all 3 children walking along a county road 11 miles outside of Harrow's Bend. They were heading toward the Branson farm. They were barefoot again, just like the day they'd been found in January. Their feet were torn and bleeding, but they didn't seem to notice. When the police picked them up, Annette said only one thing. She said, "It called us home. We have to finish what Mama started. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline." The authorities didn't know what to do with the children after that. They couldn't be placed in foster care. They couldn't be left alone, and they couldn't be sent back to Harrow's Bend because there was nothing left there for them. The state psychiatric hospital in Fulton agreed to take them, not as patients in the traditional sense, but as wards under observation. They were given their own rooms in the children's wing. They were monitored around the clock, and for the next 3 years, doctors tried to understand what had happened to them. The children were polite, cooperative. They answered questions when asked, but they never explained what they'd meant about finishing what their mother had started. They never said why they'd tried to return to the farm. And they never, not once, said they wanted to leave. In 1977, when Annette turned 12, she asked to speak to the hospital director. She told him that she and her siblings were ready to go home now. The director explained that they didn't have a home anymore. The farm was state property, abandoned and condemned. Annette smiled. It was the first time anyone had seen her smile in 3 years. She said, "That's all right. It's still waiting for us. The hospital director didn't understand what Annette meant, but he noted it in her file. Over the following months, all 3 children became increasingly fixated on the idea of returning to the farm. They would draw pictures of the barn during art therapy. They would whisper to each other in a language the staff couldn't identify, and they stopped eating, not all at once. Gradually. By the fall of 1977, Annette weighed 73 pounds. Thomas weighed 61. Claire, who was only 7 years old, weighed 38. The doctors tried everything. Feeding tubes, nutritional supplements, psychiatric intervention. Nothing worked. The children would pull out the feeding tubes. They would refuse medication. And when asked why they wouldn't eat, Annette gave the same answer every time. She said, "We're saving our strength. We need to be empty when we go back." On November 2, 1977, the hospital staff discovered that all 3 children had stopped speaking English entirely. They only communicated in that strange language, the one that sounded like wet sounds and clicks, and something underneath that made people's teeth ache when they heard it. A linguist from the University of Missouri was brought in to analyze recordings of the children speaking. He spent 4 days listening to the tapes. On the 5th day, he submitted his report and requested to be removed from the case. His report stated that the language had no recognizable grammar structure, no root words that matched any known language family, and no consistent phonetic patterns. But he noted something else. He said that when he listened to the recordings, he experienced vivid intrusive thoughts, images of dirt and darkness, and something moving beneath the earth. He said he began having dreams about a place he'd never been, a barn he'd never seen. And he said that on the 4th night, he'd woken up with his hands covered in soil, even though he'd gone to bed with clean hands and his bedroom window had been closed. The hospital director made a decision. He contacted the state attorney general's office and requested that the Branson property be excavated and sealed permanently. He argued that something on that land was exerting a psychological influence on the children and that as long as the property remained intact, the children would never recover. The attorney general's office reviewed the request. They sent an inspector to the farm. The inspector spent 3 hours on the property. He filed his report the next day. It stated that the barn had collapsed during a storm earlier that year and that the property showed no signs of recent disturbance. He recommended that the land be sold at auction and the proceeds placed in a trust for the Branson children. The request for further excavation was denied. 2 weeks later, on the morning of November 18, 1977, the staff at Fulton State Hospital discovered that Annette, Thomas, and Claire Branson were gone. Their rooms were empty. The doors had been locked from the outside. The windows were sealed. Security footage showed nothing. One moment the children were in their beds. The next moment the beds were empty. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist in one place and begun existing in another. A statewide search was launched. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters were deployed. Every law enforcement agency in Missouri was put on alert. For 3 days, there was no sign of them. On November 21, a truck driver passing through Harrow's Bend called the Highway Patrol. He said he'd seen 3 children standing in a field off Route 47. He said they were facing an old collapsed barn. He said they weren't moving, just standing there, and something about it made him feel sick to his stomach. The Highway Patrol arrived within 20 minutes. They found the Branson children standing exactly where the truck driver had described. They were facing the ruins of the barn. Their feet were buried in the soil up to their ankles. When the officers approached, the children turned to look at them in perfect unison. Annette spoke. Her voice was different now, older, deeper. She said, "We're home. We've come to finish it." And then, before anyone could stop them, all 3 children dropped to their knees and began digging into the earth with their bare hands. The officers pulled the children away from the ground, but not before they dug nearly 2 feet down into the frozen earth. Their hands were shredded, fingernails torn away, bones visible through the torn skin. But the children didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just kept reaching toward the hole they'd started, clawing at the air, trying to dig deeper. The officers carried them to the patrol cars. All 3 children had to be sedated. And as the ambulance drove them away from the property, witnesses said they heard something. A sound coming from beneath the collapsed barn. A sound like breathing, like something large and patient, stirring after a long sleep. The children were returned to Fulton State Hospital under maximum security, but they never spoke again. Not in English, not in that other language. They simply stopped. Annette died in 1981. The death certificate said malnutrition and organ failure, but the nurses who cared for her said she'd simply decided to stop living. Thomas died 6 months later. Same cause, same blank expression on his face when they found him. Claire lived the longest. She made it to 1989. She was 19 years old when she died. On her last day, a nurse reported that Claire had smiled and whispered something. The nurse couldn't make out the words, but she said it sounded like, "It's finally time." By morning, Claire was gone. The Branson property was sold at auction in 1982. A development company bought it with plans to build a housing subdivision. They brought in bulldozers to clear the land. On the first day of work, 3 pieces of heavy equipment broke down simultaneously. On the second day, 2 workers were hospitalized after experiencing sudden violent illnesses. On the third day, the foreman reported that his crew was refusing to work. They said the ground felt wrong. They said their equipment kept hitting something beneath the surface, something that wasn't rock or clay or any geological formation they recognized, something that felt soft. The development company abandoned the project. The land has sat empty ever since. Over the years, people have tried to visit the property. Curiosity seekers, paranormal investigators, journalists. Most of them don't stay long. They report feeling watched. They report hearing sounds coming from beneath the ground. Some of them have taken photographs. In several of these photographs, if you look closely at the area where the barn once stood, you can see depressions in the earth, sinkholes maybe, or something beneath the surface pressing upward. In 2003, a geology team from the University of Missouri received permission to survey the land. They used ground-penetrating radar. What they found made them pack up their equipment and leave within 4 hours. They never published their findings. But one member of the team, a graduate student named Michael Foss, spoke about it years later in a documentary that never aired. He said the radar showed a massive hollow space beneath the property, a chamber much larger than the one discovered in 1974. And he said the chamber wasn't empty. The radar detected movement, something shifting, something that had mass and density but didn't register as any known material. When asked what he thought it was, Michael Foss said only this: "Whatever the Bransons were feeding, it's still down there and it's still hungry." The town of Harrow's Bend still exists. Population 271 now, smaller than it was in 1974. People have moved away. The ones who remain don't talk about the Branson farm. If you ask them about it, they'll change the subject. They'll tell you they don't remember. They'll say it was all exaggerated, just tragedy and superstition mixed together. But on certain nights when the wind comes from the west, people in Harrow's Bend close their windows. They lock their doors. And they tell their children to stay inside, even though they won't say why. Because some stories don't end just because the people in them are dead. Some stories keep going. Buried in the dark. Waiting for someone to remember. Waiting for someone to come back and finish what was started. The Branson children tried to finish it. They knew what their mother had known. That some things can't be fed forever. That some hungers can't be satisfied. That some promises, once made, can never be broken without a price. And that price is still being paid. In that empty field outside Harrow's Bend, where the barn used to stand, where something beneath the ground is still waiting, still breathing, still hungry. And if you listen closely enough on quiet nights when the world is still, you might hear it, too. That sound of something old and patient, turning in the dark, remembering the taste of the family that fed it for so long. Remembering the children who tried to kill it, and waiting for the day when someone else will come. Someone else will dig. Someone else will make the same mistake the Bransons made over a century ago. Because the land is still there, the property is still for sale. And something beneath it is still calling out, waiting for the next family to answer, the next generation to keep the promise, the next bloodline to feed the thing that should never have been fed in the first place.